Well, before we start, I just wanted to mention that we lost a friend of our community last day. Nate Haley died. He was a kind of beautiful, generous, curious, elegant person. She had a sense of humor too, I hope. There's a friend of hers posted I never get her glasses right. Her Buddhist nun teacher, Pema Chodron, wrote, "We think that the point is to pass the test or to overcome the problem, but the truth is that things don't really get solved. They come together and they fall apart." Which in either an old Jewish saying or the American duct tape companies, since all solutions are temporary, use duct tape. It's also the second night of Passover, so thanks for coming out. Last month we were up against Easter, which doesn't seem to have had as big effect as the second night of Passover on everybody. But that's why we have our thematized drinks, the Manischewitz Spritzer. I hope you all have one. So I can say the blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. Spritzer. So now, you're all either Jewish or Catholic. Does anybody want this? Tim, you can drink this. I gotta stay straight. No. It's not a Drunken Pharaoh or the 8 Days, but there's apparently a whole genre of cocktails based on
Matt, those are really good.
Yeah, all right. So I've been trying to be more concise and trying to tighten up the show, but especially in a project today, which is about the problem of concision and the problem of edges and things that are real and not real. That quote from Chodron, and the fact that we're in Kate Thiel's beautiful exhibition, and in the corner you can see the, if I can do this, this trompe-l'oeil rendering of a house room that seems to be coming at you, occupying space that's not really there, is also part of our theme. As in fact, Passover itself, I take the sort of contrarian position that many archaeologists have recently, that Passover didn't really happen as we celebrate it in the Seders, as an exodus from slavery. There seems to be very little evidence that there were ever Jews in Egypt as slaves. In fact, they seem to have spent a lot of time eating a lot of beef in the workers' quarters. And the explanation for why this story came down is because there's been a kind of inversion in the sort of rules of legitimacy, of occupancy of territory. Today we think that if you were here first, you get to stay, it's yours. But at the time that these stories were being concocted, you won the right of legitimacy by, oh yeah, I forgot to play the drum.
This is great.
We've reached a point.
No, it really happened. It was.
I know these are good stories, but yeah.
No, it sucked me right in. It's like, didn't even think there was any point.
You're gonna,
I usually start with a little thing.
yeah, well, we were trying to say something about Nate and then we forgot. So what I was saying was, instead of being there first, you were there by power of arms. And so the story of the Passover, Exodus, was that God himself saw to the Jews' passage from Egypt into this new territory, and the conquest of the local tribes was not simply because they were there, but because they were stronger and endowed by some divine legitimacy, which is kind of nice, I guess. But back to this problem of trompe-l'oeil and painting. Trompe-l'oeil has been around ever since art was considered a sort of a craft. The famous story in Pliny of Zeuxis and Parrhasius. I always get the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Parrhasius, the two great painters trying to compete to see who was a greater painter, and Zeuxis painted a bunch of succulent grapes that were so realistic that birds flew down to peck at them. And then when it was Parrhasius' turn, he presented Zeuxis with a canvas cloaked in a curtain, and Zeuxis reached out to part the curtain, only to discover that the painting, that the curtain was a painting, and so Parrhasius was considered the winner because Zeuxis had only fooled a bird, and Parrhasius had fooled Zeuxis. Zeuxis had also was famous for creating the idea of the sort of composite, beautiful figure. He was supposed to paint a picture of Helen of Troy, but since no woman was beautiful enough to be launch 1,000 ships, he had 5 models, each with a different characteristic that he then put together. And the idea of art as a kind of window into a kind of perfection took root. In the Baroque, as scientific explanations for perception sort of began to take root, the discoveries of the Renaissance, that sort of Albertian single window to reality, was exploded into this notion that somehow pictures could show the real beyond the real, and that vast areas of space and conceptual time would sort of open up in these ecclesiastical spaces by virtue of the skills of I'm trying to make a little angel floating in the middle of some kind of apse here, but you're only 10 foot up, but you sort of see forever and ever. By the 19th century, it had become kind of a kitsch form. William Hartnett, painting violins that were so realistic that people would reach out to touch them, became kind of the norm. And these were heavily hyped in the newspapers of the time, almost to the point of a non-credibility. There are stories about, there's one famous story that takes place at a painting, a panoramic painting. Those were 360-degree paintings that were sort of like the high-tech movie spectaculars of their time. You'd walk inside and you'd be surrounded by a full-scale image of usually a battle of some kind that was so realistic that you would feel like you were transported to that place, a kind of early virtual reality. And in 1901, there was a story in the paper about an old veteran of the Confederate Army who went to see a panoramic painting, I believe, of the Battle of Fredericksburg, as General Sedgwick is leading his forces. The old man had a kind of what we call now a post-traumatic stress disorder, and he pulls out his gun, he begins firing into the panorama, and he has to be wrestled to the ground. And he claims it was a combination of the heat in his head. He said he was there again, and this was widely publicized, and I think once they patched up the holes in the panorama, did wonders for the gate at the subsequent openings. I remember my own first interest in the sort of misdirection in drawing was actually a kind of a synthesis of drawing as illusion and idea of magic. I never had this sort of temperament to learn how to do magic, but I remember there was one of those books of interesting drawings, and this was, you learn how to draw a magician with his mustachios and his sort of killer stare. And when you turned it upside down, he had become a rabbit. See, a rabbit being pulled out of a hat. I thought that was pretty cool. You know? And then more recently, I need to put this on. My friend Scott, the magic depressive magician, told me about some magic props that require almost no skill. But let me see if I can perform this. They're now called magic coloring books, but their classic name is a blow book. And you sort of say, this book is blank. Please blow on it. Just thank you. It's hard with the thumb. Ah, there we go. Look at that. Don't humor me. Let's see. All right. And then you blow on it again. And say, let's fill it in. Ah, nice. And boom, it's gone. Those books apparently go back hundreds and hundreds of years. There was a scientist, an early kind of polymath, I think is Girolamo Cardano, who made early contributions to all kinds of number theory, oddly enough, negative numbers, imaginary numbers, all sorts of. But he wrote a book in which he describes these blow books because he was interested. This was in about in the 17th century, in clarifying the fact that things that seemed anomalous, that seemed to be contrary to our senses, were not the work of supernatural, but of human ingenuity. And this was an attempt at kind of demystifying the world. Other books followed closely thereafter. The art of juggling. Juggling was another term for magic. And Hocus Pocus Jr., a man named, I think, Samuel Ridd and Reginald Scott wrote these books. Scott was particularly interesting because he was a member of this sect. Translated into English, it's like the family of love. It was like a group of intellectuals and artists who didn't believe in sort of the dogmatic rules of Catholic churches, although they were believers, but they were sort of hipsters of their time. Peter Bruegel was one, and for some reason, it's known that the lion keeper at the Tower of London was a member of this sect, which I don't know why that appeals to me, but it's one of those little facts which may or may not be true that comes down through history. Shakespeare, whose 400th birthday of his death is today, used these books to get the information he needed for the witches in Macbeth. So we have that to thank for that. Hocus Pocus, much like Brochatar Nonoi, is a set of magic words that actually either comes from the name of a magician of the time, or it's sort of dog Latin, hoc est corpus meum is this is my body, just as abracadabra, I think is from the Arabic, from my words I create reality. And it was originally an amulet, abracadabra. Then you drop a word, and then it would be bra, and it comes down to A, and then you wear this around your neck to ward off the plague. This is what happened in rehearsal, too. Is there... Are we having a functional breakdown, or should I just plow ahead?
Pay no attention to the man pay no attention that he has no sound.
Actually, early magic
What sounds better?
comes from flute time operations. You read about the ball and shell game going back thousands of years, which sort of evolved into the three-card Monte scams. And in fact, some of the earliest books of magic, card magic, which were written by hustlers, I said. It's not important. All right, so we're picking up with the shell game and three-card Monte. My friend Paul, who's here, has an interesting connection to that game. His father, who we all agree bore an uncanny resemblance to Rodney Dangerfield, literally to the point that he was mistaken for Rodney Dangerfield, am I right? And in fact signed autographs as Rodney Dangerfield. And I believe once was the marshal of a parade in a small town as Rodney Dangerfield. I made that up. I don't know. The instability of truth is another one of our themes, and the vagaries of memory. Anyway, I do remember that he once was the heavyweight boxing champion of the fleet. Was it a fleet or a army or what was it? The boxing thing. College. Oh, right. The college boxing champion. Except when Paul looked it up, there was no record of his dad being the boxing champion. So Paul asked his dad, and he said, oh, right. Well, what happened was at the end of the fight, which I won, the referee inadvertently raised the wrong man's hand. And it was instantly put into the record book, but that wasn't the way it ended. So he was a character, and one of the things that he did with his unassuming looks was work as a shill for three-card Monte hustlers on Canal Street. He would be the guy who would point out the card to the rube, and then once they saw that he could win, they would try to win as well. He was actually a very good card player. One of my favorite stories that Paul tells is that for a long time they lived in Westport, and his father took a commuter train in the morning to New York, playing and winning some high-stakes or low-stakes poker game on the train. But at some point, Paul's father and mother divorced, and the father moved back into the city, but would get up early in the morning and take a train out to Westfield in the morning so that he could commute back with all the bad card players in the morning, support himself doing that. He also tells an interesting story about a boat trip across the Atlantic. Because Paul's father didn't like flying, so they were taking a boat to Europe for some job, and he amused himself by hustling ping pong in the boat recreational area. He not only looked like Rodney Dangerfield, but he was enormous, 300-pound guy. And so all these guys would come and they'd play ping pong with him, and he would sort of lure them in and then eventually beat the pants off them. His specialty was setting up beer bottles, which I guess they'd all been consuming, on the table in order to handicap himself, but then bouncing the balls cleverly off of the bottles to win the tournament. He was making good money, except fortunately, unfortunately for him, also on the boat going over was Dizzy Gillespie and his band, who were playing, I guess, in whatever nightclub they had there. And every night after, I guess, they had been playing, Paul's father would play poker against Dizzy Gillespie's band, who collectively took him for all he was worth, because it's hard to beat the band. And so I guess once they got to Europe, he had to figure out a way to recoup his losses. That image of the ping pong table covered with these bottles came back to me recently when I was looking at a book by Ricky Jay about sort of anomalies, sideshow freaks, and all sorts of other sharpers. And it was an image there was a man called Matthias or Matthew Buckinger who lived in Germany in the 18th century. And he was renowned for a number of skills, one of which was that he could roll a ball across a field with such skill that a wine glass balanced on a bottle, he could hit the ball and so cleanly that the wine glass would settle neatly onto the grass without spilling a drop. Buckinger was also an expert marksman. He could shoot the side of a card, I believe, with one of those pistols they had back then, which weren't very accurate. He could do the same kinds of ball and cup tricks that we've been talking about with some skill. He could play numerous musical instruments. And he had 14 children by 4 different wives and was supposed to have had about 70 different mistresses. And he was a master of micro-calligraphy. There's a picture of him, self-portrait of him. You see he was wearing one of the big wigs of the time. And his name, or I guess it's the Lord's Prayer, various psalms were written in this microscopic script. There's a show of his work that just came down at the Met that Ricky Jay had collected. You were given a magnifying glass so you could inspect these and see this. Now, this is all interesting, but what's most compelling about all this is that Matthias Buckinger was 29 inches tall and was born without any legs or arms, or at least he had just teeny little flippers, and so he was billed as a little man of Nuremberg, which is where he came from, and he would travel around Europe and I think England, displaying himself and performing these amazing skills. Scott, my friend, did go to see the show. I didn't go, it bothered me that I didn't go until when I asked Scott what it was like, and he said, well, he said the thing that I suspected, sort of, which was, it was pretty amazing, but you were thinking, well, he did it with the flippers, and maybe that. It seemed to be something, at least in my mind, something about the sort of freakishness of it, or the strangeness of it. The idea that it could be done at all was more compelling than what was there. And I feel maybe that's why I didn't go, because I prefer to think that it was as incredible as it was promoted to be. So similarly to the way that those early trompe-l'oeil images were sort of discussed in the papers, sort of as a means of creating excitement about something which may or may not have actually lived up to the excitement itself. But we sort of want those things to be beautiful and perfect, even if they're not, and they're just simply strange. And he was sort of part of a tradition of people of that time. People would go see these strange fellows who were born with challenges that they had overcome. He was a remarkable character in that he lived this very full life despite the strangeness of his circumstances. But that connected to a book that Tim gave me, written by a detective in Chicago who's called the Sherlock Holmes of Chicago, whose specialty was uncovering all kinds of scams and hustles and bamboozlements of the sort of underworld in Chicago. And he published this book that was a collection of interesting stories about card hustlers and dice hustlers. One of the more interesting ones was the chapter that has the most vitriol in it is the scams against shut-ins, cripples, and invalids. And the idea is that these other hustles are potentially honorable because you're risking You're out there in the world. You're confronting your victim. You're risking being beaten up or thrown into jail or worse. But an invalid, it said, honest men and manly rogues look down on these. These are like the most sniveling, snake-like creatures because they prey on cripples and unwed mothers and all these people who can't fend for themselves. And the most famous scam that they would perpetuate was the handwriting scam. They would send letters, I don't know how, they would identify shut-ins somehow. I don't know how they would. They knew where the shut-ins were. And they would send them a letter from a firm that said they needed people to handwrite letters which they would provide to the letter writer because it was much more effective to get a handwritten letter than, I guess, a typewritten letter. This is early in the day when people didn't, expecting something written by hand would be much more compelling. And so all they required that you do was take you had to have the stationery and the pen and the ink and the pens, and then they would supply you with this cover letter, which you would then copy over. And it doesn't sound very attractive by our standards. For 2,000 letters, you get $20, or that same rate. So it's like 2 cents a copy, I think. And you could write as many as you want. They just had to make sure that you weren't conning them, so they asked you to send $1 in to cover the cost of the paper. Or actually, it was assuring them that you weren't just a disinterested bystander. And that was a con, that $1 that they got. And as they describe it, these people had to go up and down the block and scrape together the coins to get this $1. Sometimes they had to go without eating. But once they had the $1, then they invested a great deal and then they sent the paper and the pen and the cover letter. And then the whole point of the con was to keep from having to turn over giving back any part of that $1. So the people would write the letter, and then they would always find misspellings or bad punctuation or bad calligraphy, and they ensured this would happen by having the letters be full of hard-to-spell words. I still don't quite understand how that would work as a con, but as we all know, that once you've got the money, that's 90% of the 100% of the con. But what's interesting is, unlike most cons, which run on trying to get more and more money out of the person, this one seemed to run the other way. You get the $1, and then you fight like hell to keep the $1. I've been scammed a few times. Probably most of us are. The first time we go to a train station and somebody needs to have some money to go home to see their sick parent. Once you're sort of locked in with somebody, it's very hard to escape. My most elaborate scam that happened, though, was living in Williamsburg. We had one of those artisan residence buildings, and we had to rent our own dumpster. And one day, our friend Judy, who had a studio in the front, came back and said that somebody from the dumpster company had rung the bell and wanted to talk to the person who was responsible for wanted to talk to me, because I was the person who was paying the bills to the dumpster company and collecting the money from the other tenants. And so this guy comes in and he says, "So you're the guy." He sort of very assuredly talking about me as the guy who they've been communicating with, who runs the dumpster business with them. And he seems to know Judy quite well because he's been around the building. And then he says, "What we're trying to do now is innovate our dumpster collection business by adding a recycling system. There'll be a bin on the side, and every week, instead of putting all the garbage in, you just put the cardboard on the side, and the cardboard is worth something to us, so we're going to reduce the amount of money that you have to pay to the dumpster company by 20 or 30 bucks a month. And then he sort of laughs and says, of course you don't have to tell anybody else about that. You can keep that money. I said, oh, of course I would never do that. And he says, oh, of course you wouldn't ever do that. And then he spends another half hour in the studio playing with our dogs, telling me how to train the dog properly. And then finally he says, well, I've got to go. He says, now, because we have to have access to the cardboard, we need to replace the chain and lock that you have on right now with a lock of our own, so that we have a master key and we can get into all the dumpsters. You can either go get this lock, it's available at certain hardware stores, or I can just sell it to you for half the price. I said, oh, all right. I mean, by this time, I've invested so much time in this and I go, well, I don't have the money, but I think Jude does. And I went back into the back of the studio where Jude was, and I said, I'd like to say it was $10. It was like $30. How much was it? Do you remember? $30. All right. I need $30 to buy a padlock for our dumpster. This is not a scam. I did say that. I believe I said that. As soon as those words came out of my mouth, I realized this is probably a scam. But I was in this elaborate social situation. I promised this man who has helped us train the dog, I'd give him the money, and besides it was Jude's money, right? So I go back and I say, okay, here's the $30. And he goes, you got it. And he says, well, what about the chain? Don't you want to replace the chain? And at least I said no to the chain. The chain was fine, but it sort of began to increase and he said, okay, I'll go get the padlock. And as soon as he walked out the door, I knew exactly what had happened, and he wasn't there. And I called the dumpster company, which I should have done in the first place, and said, are you recycling cardboard? And she said, no, absolutely not. And about a year later, we had another tenant in that space, and he brings. So everything he said that seemed to reassure me, I realized in classic Khan's form, I told him. So he'd said, she asked to see he asked Judy to see the person who was running it, and so when I came out, he assumed that he acted like we'd been in touch, and when I said, how do you know it? And I mentioned Judy's name first, then he began to talk as though he and Judy were old friends. Anyway, it was very embarrassing. A year later, another man rings the doorbell and asks another tenant in the building to see the man who is in charge of the dumpster. And he comes in and he says, I'm from the dumpster company, and we have a cardboard recycling project and I'm not a confrontational person, so I'm in a different kind of set. He's talking, and he's spinning out the same story, and I'm nodding, and our friend John is there, and finally he gets to the end, and I said, well, this is all very interesting, and I don't know if I tortured him enough. I said, but I need to see, the ID from the dumpster company. And he said, well, it's in the car, and it's kind of a hassle to go get it a block away. I said, no, I really need to see the dumpster. I'm sorry, things have happened. And he blows his top. He says, what's the world coming to? That nobody trusts anybody anymore. And I said, I'm sorry, but I gotta see that. And he starts stomping his feet, and he's like slamming things around, and he goes out the door, and he slams the door, and our tenant said, well, what was that? And I explained the whole history. And he was sort of amazed. He thought he gave me credit for knowing what I was doing, but I didn't really know what I was doing. In fact, the whole situation was very uncomfortable because I couldn't tell where the con had begun and ended. It seemed like the first guy had really enjoyed being there and just sort of tinkering, toying with me. And that was explained by somebody telling me that that's actually what they like to do. That, you know, the idea is you appeal to the vanity or the penury or whatever it is of the person. And so first he tried money on me, and then he tried being my friend. And then this guy, Tim thinks, I mean, I couldn't tell whether he just wanted to get out of the place and he just didn't want to give me the satisfaction of knowing that I was a con, or whether that was the last moment of the dying con. Like somebody's going to go, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to distrust you, and give him the money. But at least he got out of that situation with his dignity. As I was trying to remember these things, there was another story that occurred in Chicago in this near a studio that I rented from a friend named John in a kind of a scuzzy neighborhood of Chicago. And one day we're driving to the studio from another part of town, and we're pulling off the high. There's a kind of a off-ramp from the Dan Ryan Expressway. There's a light or a stop sign about a block from the house, and a man approaches the car with a 5-gallon gas can. And he says, I'm sorry, I hate to bother you, but I'm from Joliet, downstate, and I got to town last week and I'm out of gas and I need $5 to put some money in to buy some gas, to put some gas in the car so I can get home, and here's my address, or I'll give you your address, and I'll make good on this. It's really embarrassing because I'm an upstanding citizen. And John, in the driver's seat, is looking at this guy, and when he finally pauses, he says, "Hi, Bill." And then the guy looks up. He's been in his own little con trance, just telling this story, and he realizes that they're next door neighbors. And he just backs up. He goes, I'm sorry. And John just, I don't know how much of this registered on John at the moment. And then I said, did you know that he was coming down to the highway and running these things? I said, no, I had no idea. It made me worried. Like, you can imagine now for the rest of his life, this guy is going to be known in the neighborhood for running this weird con on all the people. But the only thing about the story that bothers me is I'm actually not entirely sure if I was there or not. It's one of those stories that I can't remember if John told me a story that was so appealing that I put myself in the car with him, because I think I would know a few more details, or whether John just told me this story in a kind of historical context, and every time I saw Bill I had this, I don't even know if I saw Bill, but you certainly can con yourself.
You wanted to be there really bad.
I really wanted to be there because I wanted to be part of this cool story. I think it's a genetic trait. My father was the master at not putting himself in stories, but seeing what he wanted to see. He was a very smart man, and that was part of his problem. He was a psychiatrist, which might have also been part of the problem, because he felt like he understood people in a way that they didn't understand themselves, but he also sort of romanticized them. And we've talked a little bit about a summer we spent in a field years ago, camping out until we were booted away by people who were spying on us pooping in the field. But the reason we were in that field in tents in the first place is that my father, my mother is here, and we've been discussing this for the last 2 days. So these are more unstable memories, but we'll do the best we can. My father had the summer before walked around this island with a legendary house builder who was one of these flinty old New England types who spoke in monosyllables and didn't stand on ceremony. He had certain kind of rules about visiting and business. And he and my father had looked at these houses that he'd built around the township and had shaken hands and agreed that he would build a house on this empty land. And my father went back and said, this is how things are done in New England. You shake hands, and he builds you a building, and then you have a building, and you pay him for it. This is how men operate. And so we drive there the next year, and the field is empty. Because as I said, you didn't tell me what kind of building to build, and you didn't give me any. I mean, it was kind of inconceivable, in retrospect, that we could have thought that there would have been a house in this field. But so we bought some tents, and we're living in the tents. And there's a little pond, and the one thing we decided that we want to do is build a little dock so that we can jump off the dock. My oldest brother's 12, I'm 11, my next brother's 10, I have an 8 or 9 year old sister and a 6-year-old brother. Their birthdays are sort of occurring throughout the summer. And my oldest brother is a big newspaper reader, and he sees in the local paper that there's a motel is selling off its some rafts and some other stuff because they're renovating. And he tells my father. My father goes to see this man because he's interested in getting the raft. And he comes back with this elaborate story of this rapscallion who's charmed him, who's like been conning people in highway constructions for years, but is willing to give us these rafts for a good price and then throw in this entire motel worth of sinks and windows and doors and tables and chairs, and we can build the house ourselves. My dad, who's got a bad back and doesn't do much, and then these little boys and my mom. And he shows up, Mr. Woods, in 2 big trucks with the rafts and piles of junk. And it turns out that the trucks are too big to get to the water, so the rafts are dumped in the middle of the field, and then all this other stuff is dumped in the middle of the field. And then he charges my father some huge amount of money that he hadn't been perfected, but was too embarrassed now not to pay it. He drives away. It stayed there all summer. The rafts are still there. They've been grown over. In order to get to the beach now, a pond, we have to walk around this pile. So it haunts us 40 years later, and it won't go away. Some years later, my mother decided to go to space, which I don't know is entirely disconnected from this kind of activity. When I say my mother decided to go to space, I literally mean it. She applied to the Teacher in Space program that NASA was running, and which required a lot of work, paperwork. There was you had to fill out forms, you had to get recommendations, and the story, as I recall, is that she's walking to the mailbox with her application. It's something she's doing to sort of feel good. She doesn't fully expect to be a teacher in space, but still, put your hat in the ring to be an astronaut is a pretty big deal, especially when were you teaching second grade then, Mom, or was it kindergarten? Second grade. Second grade teacher in space. It's pretty cool. But she gets mugged, and somebody steals this application. And then, as I recall, she had to ask another brother to try to intercede to get this. The deadline's the next day, and she's going to miss the opportunity to be a teacher in space. Run out of ink here. And they have to call NASA up and say, I've been mugged on the way to the post box, and I need a special dispensation to get more paper. Apparently that's not quite what happened, but she was mugged on the way to the post office and a post office box, and she did have to call whoever was Springfield or NASA to get this special just either have the form sent back out again. And then sometime later, for some reason, this is, I guess, the true story is that Time magazine was writing a story on student scams, how students get out of homework and things like that. And at the end of the story is a sort of man bites, dog twistaroo. They say, of course, it's not always the students who do this. There was a teacher who was applying to the Teacher in Space program who claimed to have been mugged on the way to the post office box. And so, but I mean, we're very happy that in the end, Mom did get her application in, but was not selected to be the pilot on the poor Challenger that went up in smoke. Sometimes these misleading stories become true simply through sheer force of will. I'm going to try and tell this story somewhat quickly. There was a Chilean diver named Chris Lee who participated in the 1976 Olympics, platform diving, and finished well down in the rank in the finish order finish. But in 1976, in Montreal, the Canadian Games, the Canadians, in their infinite wisdom, decided that just having 3 prizes for the top 3 winners was not fair. And so they created what they called the participation medal, which was cast in aluminum. And I have a copy here. I'll tell you why. It says on the front, tout de même, everybody's the same, and it has like children in the personification of the different continents. And then on the back is the moon, and it says Montreal 1976. I think moon is sort of to show that we transcend the sort of national world barriers. Anyway, they're handing out all these awards to the non-winners, and Avery Brundage, the reactionary sort of neo-Nazi sympathizing head of the IOC, is so offended by this, he literally rushes to the stage and confiscates all of these medals and has them melted down at the foundry before they can sully the Olympic spirit in his name. But Chris Lee made off with the medal, and then became a performance artist and made this medal available to Cabinet Magazine, a wonderful arts magazine that we all know and love. And for an issue on losers, we made a copy of this. And for a small fee, you were able to purchase your own participation medal. Now, of course, that whole story is false. It's not true. There was never. Well, I won't say there was never a Chris Lee, but there was never a participation medal at all. But
was that a con?
I don't know.
Any money,
I provided an untruth for your entertainment. Now, I had a student who was legitimately an Olympic athlete. He'd been the stroke, that's the guy at the back of the boat in the 1992 Olympic Games that was supposed to win the gold medal, but instead he'd come in 4th, which is like the worst place to come in. You know, you're just out of the medal. You could have, would have, maybe should have, but you didn't. And for the launch of the magazine, that issue, we convinced our friend John to call his mother up and send him all his Olympic paraphernalia. And we all got dressed up in the boaters and the coats and everything. And then we played the Star-Spangled Banner, and we awarded him a participation medal for the for the 1992 game, and he had invited all his friends from the Olympic movement. I don't know if they were on the boat, but there were all these jocks showed up, and they could not. They probably sympathized with Avery Brundage, but we gave him his flowers and a medal, and so in effect, the con came true, I think. John was a rower, and I was interested because I had been a rower too. It was not really where I should have been. Everybody on the team had names like Saltonstall or Hathaway or the names of oil companies. But they were nice enough people, but I never quite fit in. But I did become friends, family friends of this, a similarly situated group, the Webbs, and we'd visit the house of this family, and there would be these pictures of the rowers, these Harvard rowers, these huge, handsome men, and I remember asking if this was, you couldn't tell, one was a father, one was a grandfather, one was a brother. It's like for 150 years, these men all looked exactly the same, because rowing uniforms haven't changed since about 1850, and these, I guess I have to say, I felt like I was in a completely different world than the one I belonged in. Not only was that side of the family was all the manly rowers, and then the other side of the family, I met the grandfather, a man named Royce, as in my imagination, Rolls Royce, who was this hawk-like figure, and it was kind of famous in his family that he had this amazing life story that he wanted to tell for somebody to record. And as soon as he met me, he began telling me the story. He'd been, as a young man, a fighter pilot in World War I. He flew SPADs. And then in World War II, he'd been a commando. And he'd parachuted into a Greek island, maybe it was Crete, and he led these commando raids, or sort of insurgencies in the German occupation. And he told a very strange story about how they would be up in the hills in sort of trees, and the German infantry would walk up the hill, hooting and hollering and making as much noise as they could, because the idea is that neither side really wanted to fight each other. They wanted to, and so it was sort of like when you go into grizzly bear territory, you wear a bell, you make lots of noise, because the last thing you want to do is surprise your enemy and have to have a fight. Now, I never wrote the story of Royce, but I stayed friends with the family. And years later, long after he died, the phone rang in his daughter's house, and a man called up and said, my name is Joe Silverstein, and I'm Royce's cousin, and I'm just writing a family history, and I just want to fix some details. And she said, Silverstein? No, he's not Silverstein, but he was Silverstein. In fact, nobody could ever find any record of a fighter pilot named Royce is because the fighter pilot was named Silverstein, and sometime between World War I and World War II, he turned himself into this waspy Royce. And then he continued to have this very interesting life, which he wanted somebody to write about, but it was never revealed to anybody, at least except for his own wife, that he was passing himself off as a wasp par excellence. Now his daughter felt bad because she felt she'd been misled by her own father. His grandchildren from my generation thought it was amusing. His grandson, who became a journalist, who actually I think will end up writing the story himself, as I understand it, felt kind of bad because he said, all my life, I've been the only smart, waspy kid amongst all my Jewish friends. And now I'm just another Jew. So, the story about the shooting was interesting because if you remember Sedgwick, the general, from early on, who was in the panorama that caused the old Reb to freak out and shoot, was himself a character worth noting, mostly because of his last moments. The picture of him that you see is interesting because, it's a pretty conventional picture of a Civil War general, except he seems to, if you looked at his eyes, there seems to be a twinkle in his eye, and he seems to be smiling, which may just be because he had enormous mustaches that sort of curved up. But it turns out he really was a kind of a friendly fellow, and he was known for joking around. At the Battle of Spotsylvania, he was setting up his men on a ridge about 1,000 yards away from the enemy. And every so often, a sort of speculative shot would come from the rebel ranks, and you'd hear this whining sound through the air, and the men would all throw themselves to the ground. And this man had been in the army for 30 years, and he kept pulling them up and saying, "You're embarrassing yourself. This is not how you cannot dive away from a bullet." And the men would say, "No, we have to do this because this is how we save ourselves." And he said, "You can't dive from a bullet. They couldn't hit an elephant from here." And those were his last words, because at that moment he got shot. Now, as this story is told by his lieutenant, he describes Sedgwick sort of rallying the troops and repeating this line over and over again. They can't hit an elephant, and you hear this whining sound of a bullet and people diving and him turning, and then finally there's the last one, this whining sound of the bullet, and then he's looking at Sedgwick, and Sedgwick turns to him, and he sees this terrible wound under his eye, and he falls into his arms, and he's dead. There's a statue of Sedgwick at West Point, and apparently he's wearing spurs with the little rowels, those little spikes on them, and if you get dressed in your full cadet uniform at midnight, and you go down there and you spin the rowelings and you run home before his ghost can catch you, you will pass the exam on the night that you will have the next day. But if his ghost catches you, you'll fail the exam, which seems sort of like an anticlimax. But that moment, that long moment of the bullet rushing towards Sedgwick, reminded me of a Borges story, The Secret Miracle. And Borges is interesting because he's a writer who employs the techniques of trompe-l'oeil, of the illusion of time, compression of time and space into impossible spaces in a way that's credible. But this story in particular is interesting. It's about a man who is a writer, I believe, in Prague. In 1939, the Nazis invade, and he's arrested for prior work and condemned to death by firing squad in 10 days. So he spends 10 days in this sort of state of suspended animation. He considers himself immortal for these 10 days, but also dead at the same time. And his main regret, as Borges says, is that he has not finished this elaborate play in verse that he's composed about a nobleman who is who's bothered by all these people who are seeking his attention, particularly that of a man who was once the suitor of his fiancée, who's lost his mind and now believes that he is the nobleman. And as the play is supposed to unfold, time begins to repeat itself and back and forth, and you begin to realize that the nobleman begins to realize that he is in fact the figment of he is the man who imagines him to be. It's one of those Borgesian triple flip stories that Borges actually started making fun of the story, but he says he's clear about the earnestness of the writer wanting to complete this. And the night before he's supposed to be executed, he has a dream which he's able to ask God for a year of time to complete the play. That's all he wants to do. And then the next morning he's taken out to be executed at 9 in the morning. And he gets to the yard at 8:45, and being good Germans, they have to wait 15 minutes to shoot him. And so he's sitting there on a pile of wood, and they give him a cigarette to smoke. He doesn't smoke a cigarette. And finally it becomes time, and they put him up against the wall, and they aim the guns at him. And as they're about to say, fire, time stops. Stagecraft. And he realizes that he's been granted this year and this time between the bullet leaving the gun and hitting him. And he goes through the entire play, word for word, makes all the corrections he needs to do. And finally he's at the last word. He's trying to decide what the last thing the character would say, and then he begins to cry out the word, and then time begins again, and the bullets hit him, and he falls down dead. That story is sort of eerily similar to Ambrose Bierce's story that we talked about before, the incident on Owl Creek, where a man is in the Civil War being executed for some minor trespass and is pushed off a bridge to be hung, and the rope snaps, and he's able to escape and race to his family to see his wife and children. And just as he reaches them, his head snaps back, and he dies because all this transpired in the moment between the drop from the bridge and his death. Sedgwick. Sedgwick, you might recognize the name. I told you I have a lot to cover. We're trying to get through this fast. Sedgwick was a great-great-uncle of Edie Sedgwick, the Warholian It Girl, but he was also gave his name to a obscure but curious man named Ernst Sedgwick Hofschnagel, whose mother was a Sedgwick, but whose father was a Austrian art publisher. And he grew up sort of between these two worlds, half Aryan, half Wasp. And he went to Harvard and was known as a kind of friendly fellow who wrote fight songs for the Harvard football team. And graduated in 1909, and then moved to New York and became a kind of, his whole life he was a bit of a zealot character and a kind of Wasp zealot. He knew he knew Teddy Roosevelt, he knew Franklin Roosevelt, and most strangely enough, he moved in an art scene, and he and Juna Barnes were going to be married. And he, in fact, broke Juna Barnes' heart by telling her that he needed to marry a good German woman. So she had to go write Nightward and go on to be Juna Barnes. And he moves to Europe, to Austria, and is contacted in the 1920s, I believe, by a Harvard friend who was working in the American Embassy to go use his knowledge of all things German to see what's going on with this rabble-rouser Adolf Hitler, who's causing trouble and speeches around the city. And he becomes completely besotted with Hitler. And they become friends, and Hitler becomes his godfather to his son. Apparently his wife at the time convinced Hitler not to commit suicide when the beer hall putsch failed. But eventually there's a kind of there's a kind of falling out between him and the people around Hitler's circle, Goebbels and the Mitford sisters. And then he gets Hitler mad at him himself when he questions the fighting spirit of the German soldiers at the time of the Spanish Civil War. And Hofschnagel receives a call from one of Goebbels' assistants who tells him he's going to have to complete a secret mission for Hitler. And he's going to have to get into a plane and fly from Berlin to Spain and parachute into Spain to make contact with the national forces, Franco forces, to coordinate some activity. And he doesn't want to do this. He's not a fighter, but he has this fancy uniform. So they put him in the plane and they fly him from Germany to Spain. And then the pilot turns to him and says, "I'm sorry, the plans have changed. You have to parachute here into the Republican side, which means certain death." And he freaks out and he makes the pilot land the plane and he runs away. And it turns out this is Adolf Hitler's idea of a prank. The plane has actually been flying over Berlin the whole time, and he wanted to teach him a lesson about fighting spirit, I think. But Hofschnagel runs away. He goes to Sweden, and he sort of spills his guts, and he tells them everything he knows about Hitler, and goes on to live a long, not entirely admirable life. The last thing he does, I believe, is attend his 65th anniversary at Harvard and teach them all the fight songs. Now, the odd thing is that those fight songs that he wrote for the Harvard football team, he then translated into marching songs for the brown shirts and Hitler Youth. And the Sieg Heil chant, according to him, is a version of the Harvard football cheers. But none of that came up in the discussions at the 65th anniversary of the graduation. He died a year later. You might have seen an obituary today, I'll say this very quickly, of Friedrich Meyer, who died at 94 just recently, a Jewish refugee from Austria who did parachute into Innsbruck, landed on a glacier, and was instrumental in coordinating resistance to the Nazis, and then went on to live a perfectly normal life as a power plant inspector before dying at 94 last week, without apparently what his friends called a fear gene. So I'm just saying, it is possible to parachute behind enemy lines. More to Hitler's taste was a man named Otto Skirnsey, a scar-faced, dashing commando in the SS, who was an engineer by training, but was most famous during the war for overseeing the rescue of Mussolini when he has been captured by partisans and flown to a mountaintop area. They engineered this daring rescue by glider that earned Skirnsey Hitler's admiration. But after the war, put him on numerous death lists, which he managed to escape, perhaps by the aid of American Secret Service or other SS members who dressed up in American uniforms and got him out of the prisons, and he went to Spain, where Franco is, and he lived in a pretty nice life. Married the daughter of the finance director of the Nazi Party. Wrote a book about his adventures, which made him a bestseller. He's actually the model for Ernst Blofeld when Ian Fleming wrote the Bond novels. The Blofeld character, unlike the Donald Pleasance bald-faced character, looked almost exactly like Skirnsey, who was involved in all sorts of international operations to try to rescue Nazis. And then when Mike Myers created Dr. Evil based on the Blofeld version of Skirnsey, that's a sort of secondary imitation of Skirnsey. Skirnsey, as I said, was living in a villa in Spain with his wife, and they were in a nightclub when these two attractive young Germans come in, soaking wet from the rain, their car having been totaled in a wreck outside, and they sit down with this older couple, and they begin talking and drinking and becoming more and more friendly, and finally Guernsey and his wife invite the couple back to their house, and just as things are getting a little bit kinky, he pulls out a gun, and he says, "I know who you are, but I have to drop on you. You're from the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service. You're here to assassinate me, but I'm too clever for you." And they said, "Well, we are from the Mossad, but if we'd wanted to assassinate you, we would have already assassinated you. We actually are here to turn you. We want you to become a secret agent for the Israelis, because you know all the German scientists who are the ones who didn't go to the United States or Russia were now in Egypt creating rockets to be sent into Israel. And we can give you a lot of money." And he says, "I don't want money. I want to be off of the Simon Wiesenthal list of people who are to be executed as ex-Nazi war criminals." And they say, "No problem," but they didn't know. They had no right to say that. They actually made up a letter that they signed with Wiesenthal's name saying he was not going to be assassinated, which Wiesenthal didn't agree to. But he then spent the rest of it, he became a good spy. I guess whoever he worked for, he did a good job. He gave them the lists of the ex-Nazi scientists, and he actually killed a few of them too, to show his bona fides. And he lived out his life, and not in respect, and died of cancer in about 1975. Although there's a rumor that he had his scar removed and lived for another 30 years before dying about 10 years ago at the age of 100. My grandfather was born in Russia in the town called Dogshits. Never liked to hear anyone say Merry Christmas. I remember being in the house once when somebody on Christmas said Merry Christmas. He got up and be very upset. He said, "How can you say Merry Christmas? Thousands of Jews were murdered on Christmas." That was his experience. The family had left Germany, Russia, and Poland, the Pale long before, but all the family that had remained behind had been murdered in the Holocaust. And my father was sort of a child of this history, did not adopt the religious feelings of his father, his grandfather, but became a scientist, I think for the same kind of absolutist romantic reasons. He said he wanted to understand evil, what evil was, and he spent his lifetime studying sort of extreme personalities. I remember as a very young boy looking with him at World Book, and we came to the picture of Hitler for some reason, and he stopped and he said, "You want to see what a real bastard looks like?" And he showed me that, and I was completely traumatized that, A, because I didn't know what a bastard was, and B, I didn't know who Hitler was, and C, I'd never seen my father upset like that. And I never could quite put that all together, but the idea of a bastard, the idea of an insult like that attached to somebody who I didn't know created instantly this sort of vision of an unstable world that I did not really recognize. I didn't know who this was, I didn't know why somebody who I had no contact with would be worthy of this, clearly this terrible insult of this sort of existential proportions. But back to the field with the piles of junk. Now, the only thing that we all seem to agree on is that at some point in the course of the summer, four posts were put into the ground that were then turned into a clothesline. It was the only thing that was sort of functional in the field. My mother wanted to have some place to dry things out. When my father saw what happened, he was very upset because he held on to this vision that somehow we would make use of all this stuff that he had bought. And when the summer ended, he had added to it by buying a store window full of wicker furniture at a very cheap price that now had to be protected as well. So he conceived of the plan of turning these 4 posts of a clothesline into a house, or at least a shelter for all the stuff that he'd accumulated over the course of the summer. And he said, well, go to the lumberyard and we'll buy wood. Now, my younger brother Josh, who's a very analytical kid, even at the age of 11, said, okay. And he sat down and he measured all the distances, and he figured out how much wood there would be needed to sort of fill in the gaps between all of the posts. And my father said, no, that's not how you do this. You just get the wood and you begin attaching the wood to each other until you get from one post to another. And my brother, at the age of 11, I think had this sort of my existential experience of seeing my father angry about evil was nothing compared to his experience at the age of 11 of realizing that he was more rational than his father was. But we bought the wood, and now this is where all sorts of memories diverge. My memory is that we hammered one piece of wood into a post and realized there was no way we were able to accomplish it, and we stopped working. But everybody else agrees that we were a little bit more accomplished than that. We took the 4x8 sheets and hammered them together. This is a crew of a 13-year-old, a 12-year-old, an 11-year-old, our mother, and then our father sitting on the sidelines supervising. So we built these panels, and one may have gone on the ground, and then another was attached to a side. Now, perhaps that's where the work stopped, but then certain brothers believe that we actually achieved a cube-like construction in the middle of the field in which all of this stuff was placed. There's some doubt about what happened to the roof, whether this was a tarp or not. My brother Josh, who seems to have the most precise memories, claims that we had this 4x4 sheet, and my mother, the would-be astronaut, in a feat of superhuman strength, actually pushed this 8x8 sheet of plywood up onto the roof, and that somehow we nailed it all into place. Whatever happened, it was not functional. By the next summer, it had all fallen apart and everything was a wreck. But the last moments of this experience that we all can agree on is that we paused, either in failure or in fatigue, in this field with this construction, and my father said, I have a book to read. And we sat down, and he took out his copy of Moby Dick. And as the sun set, honest to God, he read us Moby Dick. And he was a beautiful reader. That was one thing he could do well. Thank you. Fun. There's a payoff.